This program was produced through the facilities of the Telecommunications Board of Northern Kentucky, providing professional video cameras, editing, studio, and training to participating communities. For more information, log on to tbnk.org. Welcome to Discover Northern Kentucky. In this two-part episode, we will travel to the Dinsmore Homestead to learn about the fascinating family history, the Dinsmore Foundation, and the State Nature Preserve. The beautiful Dinsmore Homestead in Boone County, Kentucky. It's not only one family's history, but the story of all Americans from the 1840s to the 1970s. Here in the hills of northern Kentucky is a fascinating archive of a very interesting family. The Dinsmores had direct connections to 7 U.S. presidents. The family was well-traveled and educated, but still struggled to work the soil and make a living like most people in Kentucky. In 1838, James Dinsmore came to northern Kentucky from his plantation in Louisiana to buy some Arcadian land his uncle had written him was for sale. By 1847, he had acquired 900 acres, much of which were hills, since hills were cheap. But he did have about 500 acres of fertile farmland. In 1841, he started building on the property. His wife and daughters were in Lexington, Kentucky at a boarding house, so the girls could go to school, unlike they'd been able to do in Louisiana. In the summer of 1842, after James was able to sell the Louisiana plantation, the family moved into the house. His main crops were wheat, barley, corn, and sweet potatoes. He also had a 12 to 15 acre orchard where he grew multiple varieties of apple, pear, plum, cherry, and peaches. There were several vineyards on the property. From them, he sold grape cuttings, and in 1860, he made 300 gallons of wine. In 1860, he had 150 merino goats and Southdown sheep, known for really fine wool, and they produced about 100 pounds of wool. Tobacco wasn't grown on the farm until after the Civil War. It seems like James Dinsmore did pretty well, not just because of the farming he did in Kentucky, but in addition to the 11 slaves he brought with him, he had about 15 enslaved people in Louisiana that he hired out for $1,000 to $1,500 a year. Along with the slaves, there were tenants who built cabins on the property and made baskets from the osier willows that were growing on the farm. With the profits, he was able to buy nice things to put in his house and some of the latest farm equipment. The extra money he left with merchants in Cincinnati, where it earned interest.
There was a bank in Covington where he did get loans from, but he kept his money, his ready money that he wanted to use in Cincinnati at a store owner's.
When James died in 1872, the farm was inherited by his daughter, Julia. She was 9 when she came to Kentucky and never married. She took care of the farm for 54 years and lived to be 93 years old. She kept a daily journal, writing about life on the farm. Julia was very well educated. Her parents believed that girls should be as well educated as boys, so they went to the Young Ladies Seminary in Cincinnati. Julia studied rhetoric, how to argue, a rare subject for a young woman at that time. She was fluent in German, Italian, and French. She also took algebra and geometry. Of the more than 2,000 books at the Dinsmore Homestead, most belonged to Julia. After attending the seminary in Cincinnati, she came back to help her father manage the farm. After the Civil War, her father's rheumatism made it difficult for him to get around, and Julia took an even more active part in running the farm. When James died, she was ready to take over the farm.
She never married, and we've had some discussion about that. We aren't really sure why. It doesn't seem like there's as many letters between family members during the Civil War as there were after the Civil War. Could be some of those letters weren't saved, but she did have several boyfriends during the Civil War and afterwards, according to letters we do have. But she did know men from Louisiana, so it's possible. We did find one proposal that a man wrote to her from Louisville, Kentucky, and he wrote something to the effect of, "I will take you away from the horrible cares of outdoor life." But she apparently said no, so either she didn't like the man or she felt very secure in her position here. And although she didn't like working on the farm or managing the farm initially, she did seem to grow into it. She was a success. She often made a profit on the farm, and I think that made her feel really good about herself being a woman and being able to manage a farm when most women weren't doing that. And the one quote they had where she felt so unlike a lady, on her inside. She probably wasn't much like a lady on her outside anymore. That was in 1875, soon after she took over the farm. And she did talk about wanting to sell it, but then we do have someone who's transcribing the journal, and she found an entry where one of the neighbors did say, okay, I'll buy some of your land. And the big argument they had was who was going to pay some sort of fee for entering the title, a very small payment. So the fact that she said, okay, forget the whole deal, I think indicates that she really didn't, she was nervous about giving it up. Plus she has a graveyard up on the hill where her family's buried, and she was very attached to that. So I think it would have taken a lot for her to really sell the property. She would write letters about going up to the graveyard, sitting on the rock wall, watching the sunset. So it was a place where she would spend time.
Another thing that they may have gone on the hill for, probably had a breeze up there. And you might have got rid of a few mosquitoes or flies and so forth that would have been in the house or down in the lower areas. And that is, any place in the Ohio River Valley is going to be kind of a humid spot anyway. And so and not only but where the cemetery is, you could also see, at that time where they had it a little more cleared, you could actually see the Ohio River from that spot.
Julia had two sisters. Her younger sister, Susan, whom the family called Susie Sweet, died in a boating accident on Lake Erie at the age of 15. In 1851, she had left home for the first time to visit cousins in New York State. They went out on the lake in a leaky boat. Because she didn't know how to swim and was most likely wearing a corset and several petticoats, she drowned. Her body was brought back to Boone County and was buried in the cemetery on the hill. James wanted something to remember Susan by, so there's a print that now hangs in the dining room of a girl that looks like Susan. The only sister to marry was Julia's older sister, Isabella. After her wedding in the family parlor in 1859, she moved to Minnesota. During the Civil War, she returned to the homestead and gave birth to Patti. 5 years later, she came back again and gave birth to Sally. In just 6 months, Julia was in Minnesota taking care of Isabella, who had become ill. Soon after, at the age of 37, Isabella died. Julia and Isabella's husband agreed that she would take the girls back to the Dinsmore Homestead and raise them as her own. Julia died in 1926, and the farm was inherited by her niece, Sally Cutchin. Patti Psalms had already died. Sally died in 1948. She had no children, so she passed the farm on to Patti's daughter, Isabella Greenway, James Dinsmore's great-granddaughter. She had become the first congresswoman from Arizona and had the idea of turning the house into a museum. She died in 1953, and the homestead passed on to two sons and a daughter, Robert Ferguson and Martha Ferguson Breasted, and their half-brother Jack Greenway. It was Martha Breasted that managed to make that dream of a museum come true. Some of the Dinsmore Homestead's connections to historical people are because of Patti Psalms.
Patti had very interesting relationships with fairly well-known people and very well-known people in the United States, probably because of her education, we think. She was educated in Cincinnati as a young girl and became very well-read and actually wrote articles that were later printed in magazines. But when she married a young lawyer from Minnesota who was a partner with her father's firm. They married, and the man decided he wanted to be a rancher. He had already purchased part of a ranch near Mandan, North Dakota. So they went out there to live as newlyweds, and one of their neighbors happened to be Teddy Roosevelt. So they got to be fairly close friends with Teddy Roosevelt, and after both of them left North Dakota, the Psalms family and Teddy Roosevelt left North Dakota, they still continued to keep in contact through letters, and when Teddy Roosevelt would go out hunting in the West, he would always stop by in St. Paul and visit and spend time with the Psalms family. So we have several deer heads that come from out west, and we believe that those were shot by Patti or her husband, Tilden Psalms, when they were on hunting trips with Teddy Roosevelt. Patti also got to know Gutzen Borglum, who did Mount Rushmore, and that was a relationship that passed on to her daughter. But Gutzen Borglum, we have a picture of a bust of Lincoln that he signed over to Patti. Isabella, when she went to school in New York City as a young girl, she became acquainted with Eleanor Roosevelt, and the two of them became lifelong friends and political partners also, until Isabella showed her disapproval for Franklin Delano Roosevelt's running for a third time as President of the United States. But up until then, they were close friends. Afterwards, they were still correspondents.
Isabella became the first congresswoman from Arizona. She gave the speech to nominate Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the 1932 Democratic Convention. She was very involved in the Democratic Party. When Martha Breasted took over the farm with her brothers, they were simply making payments to tenants to keep the farm running. One of those tenants was Harry Roseberry. He had been there since the 1870s. When he was 14, Julia liked the way he worked. She taught him to read and write since there were often no schools nearby for African Americans. They had a very hard time getting an education in this part of Kentucky.
She did mention that some roughs had burned his school down in 1896, I believe it was. And so she started teaching him from Patti's old school books. When he married in the early 1900s, Julia built a small house for him. And as he and his wife had 4 daughters, she built onto each side of that building. So now our gift shop is in what we call the Roseberry house. But Harry Roseberry was the one who remained on the property after Julia died with his family, would allow a cleaning lady to come in the house, clean things that were here, but keep them in the same place generally, and then lock the door after she left. So it's really thanks to Harry Roseberry that everything in the house is original, and not a whole lot broke while he was in charge.
By the 1960s, Robert Ferguson and Jack Greenway were losing interest in the place. So Martha, who had become entranced with the history of the homestead, made it her mission to find someone to buy the farm and turn it into a museum. She approached the University of Kentucky and Northern Kentucky University. Neither put up funds because they thought it would cost too much to keep up. After her brother Robert died, Martha convinced Jack to give up his interest if she found a buyer. A group of local citizens got together and asked her to give them 2 years to raise $1 million so they could buy the homestead.
Martha thought this would be an interesting place for a museum. I think she wanted to finish what her mother had started. Her mother had taken a very detailed inventory of what was in the house. So I think they knew that this house had a lot of items and artifacts that other houses didn't have. In addition, it seems like even starting with James, the family was almost obsessive about saving things. So we have 40,000 pages of letters and journals, receipts from things they bought all the way back to the 1700s. They saved everything. And even when I found one reference in a letter of Julia's that the floorboards in the parlor were loose, instead of having someone come in and replace the floorboards like you would expect, she had them support the floorboards from below. She didn't want anything replaced. So even the family themselves, back to a very early time, were interested in conserving. I don't know if they thought that their lives would end up special or what they were really thinking, but they saved all their letters as mementos to themselves so they could go back over and read them. But they also saved all their artifacts. And I'm not sure, I think they must have seen or believed that they had enough here that would be of interest to somebody at some point. But a lot of historic homes you go into today, they do have to go out and get things. Buy tables, buy a new sideboard that would fit into the time period they're doing. Here we don't have a specific time period because the family lived here for so long. We can go from 1842 all the way up into the 1960s. I think it's fascinating because you can see so many different parts of history. You can read the documents and get the documentary evidence. You can go back to different places that the family lived in Louisiana, Mississippi, find information about them there, information that's corroborated by the letters that you read, but also you get the material culture. People really define themselves by what they had. And so you can see a lot about what they thought of themselves and what they tried to project to other people.
While the family seemed to be interested in preservation, that may not have included personal letters.
There are some instances where some of the letters will have at the end, especially this was very common with Sally. Sally would often write at the end of her letters, "After you read this, don't forget to burn it." Julia never burned things, from what we can tell, but she would occasionally write to Sally. She wrote her one letter once, said, "I'm burning your letters, but as I was doing it, I came across this one letter where we were talking about such and such." So I think that's interesting because it indicates that Julia would go up to the attic, get these old letters out from 30 years ago, read them over again, and then pretend she was going to burn them. But we still have so many letters If she did burn them, there's no evidence that we're missing anything of importance. But the girls, because they were all females, they wrote an awful lot to each other twice a week, or Julia would be worried that something had happened to them. So they do break that rule every now and then, but they did try to write twice a week to each other. And that gives us a huge number of letters between the 1870s and 1920s. I think this homestead is really important to the region, especially because it shows some of the work styles in an now we're such a business-oriented area. There's still a rural part of northern Kentucky, but it's getting smaller and smaller every year. And I think it's interesting, especially for young children, to come through here and get an idea of what northern Kentucky used to be like. Most Boone County men back in the 1800s worked as tenants on a farm. So here you not only get the idea of what farmers did, but you also get the idea that there were wealthy farmers and there were primarily, dominantly, not very wealthy farmers. People who worked for wages, people who worked on shares. And also, I think this is a very instructive place for African American history because we have an idea of what it was like, somewhat what it was like for the enslaved people who lived here and worked for James Dinsmore, and what happened to them after the Civil War, when Boone County did become a violent place for African Americans to live. I think one of the neat things about Dinsmore is that it's part of this whole new idea of the Ohio River Valley when you think not so much in terms of the North and the South, or even the Upper South. If you think about the Ohio River and how it connected people instead of separated people, James Dinsmore bought a lot of things in this house from Cincinnati. His daughters went to school in Cincinnati. When he went to seances or to see the phrenologist, he did that in Cincinnati. But also most of the caskets, oddly enough, that the family used up in the graveyard were bought in Indiana. A lot of the bricks that were used here were bought in Indiana in later years. So both places, he was constantly going to Rising Sun or Aurora, or he was going to Cincinnati to buy things. When Julia was selling the fruit from the orchard, it would be people from Indiana and Cincinnati coming over to pack it up in barrels and take it home.
Dinsmore is also a valuable part of women's history in northern Kentucky and Cincinnati.
The women here were very unique for their time period. And what's interesting is that when Julia was living here, there were all sorts of women coming in and staying. It was really a female place. She knew people in Cincinnati, women in Cincinnati, and they had connections to some of the artists that were becoming important in the Cincinnati wood carving age. And she became acquainted with Enid Yandell, who went to the Art Academy in Cincinnati. So Enid Yandell and a young lady named Amy Campbell would constantly be visiting here. They would leave their horses here with Julia to take care of. And Julia did also get to know some of the women she knew from Lexington and earlier Louisiana would also come by and stay. James adopted his niece, Susan Goodrich, who was a sister to B.F. Goodrich. And Susan Goodrich would come back every year of her life until she reached her 80s to visit Julia and brought her children with her. So this was a very busy place most of the time. Until Julia was about 85, there were constantly people, and primarily women, coming in and visiting, and they had their own little social life here. And one of them, Enid Yandell, actually, I believe she was giving a talk at a club, a country club, or a women's group, and she wrote a little story, and I found a copy of it in the Filson Society. And it was a cute little story just about that. It was written about 1890 to 1900, and it was about taking a break from that urban rush and coming out here into the country and just relaxing. She talked about there being hammocks around the property in the backyard. She talked about playing tennis on the lawn tennis court and going up to Burlington, and it was a bunch of young ladies went up to Burlington, asked for some beer, and they said the next time they showed up in Burlington, everybody came out to stare at those ladies who wanted beer. So they were some radical young women out here, apparently very different from a lot of the people who lived around here all the time.
common in America during the mid-1800s was the study of spiritualism.
Interesting reading. Now we would consider spiritualism very odd, but in the 1850s, spiritualism was a new area of research, I suppose you could say, and James was very interested in it. Perhaps because his daughter died in 1851, but in 1849, spiritualism kind of grew out of upstate New York with the rappings by two young girls, and it grew into a movement that extended all the way to New Orleans with magazines being written. And James did buy books on spiritualism. He subscribed to magazines written in French on spiritualism and magazines from New England on spiritualism. And he took his daughters to Cincinnati to see mediums and wrote about that. He would also write to his relatives and say, oh, by the way, I talked to your mother the other day, and send them off little quotes of what their dead family members said. But to him, this was actually a science. I did start doing a little reading about this outside of Dinsmore. And spiritualism, they really did believe that if you could talk to people who were up in heaven or what they called summer world, that other place out there, then they actually had a better idea of what was going on Earth, and they might be able to help Americans or whoever perfect the world. So the whole idea behind spiritualism really was to make this a better place to live in. So it was seen as more of a science or religion than what we would consider today as a pseudoscience. When he died, he considered himself a spiritualist. And he would joke about it. If he knew someone wasn't going to take him very seriously, he would kind of joke. So I did find a letter from 1856 written to a friend in the South where he was talking about sectional troubles that eventually would lead to the Civil War. And he said, oh, if I could talk to the spirits about this, I'm sure they could tell me what's going to happen. But said, I haven't been able to get a hold of him or something like that. So he never did, but as far as we know, but he would joke.
The journals and letters give an indication of the lives of the African Americans on the farm.
And some of those indicate that there were freed black people living on the property prior to the Civil War, and about 11 to 15 enslaved African Americans on the property before the Civil War. So anywhere from 11 to 18 or so blacks on the farm. The younger children, when James brought them up from Louisiana, 7 of the 11 African Americans were children, and they did little jobs helping Mrs. Dinsmore, helping probably Nancy Magruder, who lived in this building, we believe, with the cooking, and probably helping with the spinning of the sheep's wool and goat's wool that was raised here. There was a community here that seemed to be like a thriving community. They talked about weddings, funerals, and the African American minister would officiate at these. I don't know how accurate, it's hard to tell how accurate some of these descriptions are, but it does seem like there were more than just the African Americans that James brought with him. During the Civil War, the number of slaves increased because the slaves he had in Louisiana and Missouri were sent here when those places were invaded by the Union Army.
One of those slaves served in a black Union regiment during the Civil War.
Boone County was primarily a supporter of the Union Army, but after the Civil War, there was a lot of Confederate sympathy in Boone County and became a very Confederate place after the war, I suppose. I think one of the neat things about this place is that, like the Dinsmore family, as far as the African Americans go, you also hear personal stories about each of them, so it makes them very real to people who come and visit. And there was an enslaved person here named Dave. We aren't sure exactly how old he was, but now I'm beginning to believe that he was born in Louisiana. His father and mother were owned by James Dinsmore in Louisiana, so he was also. But he remained down there when James came up here. And he would have come up here probably when he was in his late teens in the early 1960s, and he signed up with the Union Army. Now, James was paid when he signed up with the Union Army. James was given some sort of bonus for helping to fill out the recruitment level. But Dave was freed when he did that. We did have Nancy Magruder, the slave woman who lived in here, in this building, ran away after the Civil War. But she was still considered a runaway because Kentucky was the last state to free the slaves after the Civil War. They weren't technically freed until December of 1965. She ran away in September of 1965 and was kicked out of the local church for doing so. But we have letters that she wrote back home, or back to Julia Dinsmore, after running away, and she did eventually return here and died here at the age of about 96, many years later. So there was this community in Rising Sun that would travel back and forth, and there were often African Americans who would stay here, maybe for a month or 2 months, go back over to Rising Sun where their family was, come back later. Apparently the racial relations in Rising Sun were quite a bit better than here. Julia would always go over, in the wintertime especially, and buy coal for the 2 families that lived over there. And if someone died and needed money for burials, Julia would take care of that. She took care of doctor bills. But Rising Sun, when I looked at the 1870 census, almost 95% of the African Americans in Rising Sun had been born in Kentucky. So there was a big movement over there. And there was a Freedmen's Bureau set up in Kentucky later than in most other southern states. And the agent who stayed in Covington, the agent for this county, stayed in Covington and wrote his superiors, and this was copied in a book that I read, that Boone County, the feelings were so vicious in Boone County. And he says, you know, this is odd coming from me, because he said that he had worked in Mississippi, worked in southern Alabama and other states in the deeper South, and didn't recognize the vitriol and hatred that he encountered in Boone County. So there was some violence. One morning, Julia wrote in her journal that she found a note attached to her gate, and then we found the note that she had tucked inside her journal. And it was written in pencil, it was kind of scrawled. The spelling was very bad. The writing wasn't so great, but it said something to the effect of, Miss Dinsmore, or Miss Julia, I think her neighbors called her Miss Julia, you need to get rid of the African Americans, not in that language, and remove them from your place, or we're going to turn your farm upside down and burn your barn, and various threats. I think one of the interesting things about this place is that you get those individual stories, and a lot of times when you go places and they do need to talk about slavery and post-Civil War freed people, they have to talk in general terms because they don't know the stories, they don't know exactly who lived on the property. Whereas we have a watercolor of Nancy Magruder, we have a picture done of Angelina, who was Sally Taylor's daughter. And we have letters that mention these people and journal accounts that talk about these people an awful lot. So it's very interesting how you get the view of what it was like for people living back then. And one of the interesting things about Julia is that Julia Dinsmore did, as a young girl, think slavery was a good thing. She supported the Confederacy during the Civil War because she knew people from the South. And she talked about African Americans in what today would be considered a very racist way. But as she saw these people getting older, as Nancy Magruder came back and she nursed Nancy when Nancy was getting to be 80, 85 years old, and she started meeting other African Americans and had this very personal relationship with them, she seemed to really change her tone. And there was trouble in the family once when Julia Farley Loving, an African American who's buried up in the graveyard, she had trouble with Isabella Greenway. And Julia said, you guys need to end these troubles, end the bickering, because we all go to the same place when we die. We all age the same way. And it was just very touching because I think she did start to change her ideas about race as she got older. One of the most interesting things about the Dinsmore Homestead that I noticed when I was studying history, American history, is that people like the Dinsmores show up in all sorts of history textbooks, but only in generalities. This is what people did. Men moved to Texas and the Texas Revolution happened. And we have letters from before the Texas Revolution about those horrible Mexicans and the Indians that lived down there and how savage they were, written by Dinsmore family members to Dinsmore family members. Dinsmores show up in history textbooks, or their relatives do. So they